Hey, if you're a fan of the band Ratt, then today's video is for you. A week ago, we did a video on Queensryche's Rage for Order on the day that it came out. And then a few days later, we did a video on Judas Priest Screaming for Vengeance the day that it came out. And so today, I walk into the studio and I'm thinking, I wonder what would have happened on July 3rd that we could talk about today. And I looked it up, and amazingly, Stephen Pearcy's birthday is July 3rd of 1956. And so I thought, okay, we're talking about Stephen Pearcy today. Now, if you follow this channel with any regularity, you know that one of my favorite bands from back in the 1980s was Ratt. And this record right here, this is the one that I bought back in 1984 when it came out. But it wasn't until many, many years later that I started learning about Stephen Pearcy and his kind of unusual success story. And I don't know that everybody knows about all the things that he went through. And maybe if you're a fan of Ratt, maybe you already know all this stuff. And maybe there'll be some things in here if you are a fan that you hadn't heard before. And I got out, while I was at it, I got out their EP. This was the EP that they put out that really kind of got the attention of the record industry because they sold so many copies of it. And this is one of the coolest band pictures, I think, that they ever took. And it was on the back of this EP. And of course, there's Stephen Pearcy. So what makes Stephen Pearcy's story so interesting from a rock star standpoint is that there was nothing in his childhood that would have led anybody to think that he was going to pursue a career in music. There was just nothing about that. What he actually became interested in when he was about 14 years old was drag racing. And he became infatuated with it. I mean, he would go and watch the races and he would try to get involved with it. And he managed to meet a guy named Walt Rhodes, who was a fairly well-known drag racer in the area, actually took Stephen, this 14-year-old kid, out to Indianapolis with him to work with him on his crew. And it wasn't Indianapolis 500, it was some other races that were going on out there. But again, Stephen Pearcy was immersing himself from a young age to be involved with racing. And one of the things that Stephen Pearcy talks about in his book, and I loved this, he says the thing that made him so interesting in racing were these 4 different things. He says it was the danger, the noise, the speed, and the style. And I thought, that's so interesting that those are the things that attracted him to racing, when really those are also the things that you associate with rock music. You've got danger, noise, speed, and style, that all those things come together in music. And so Stephen Pearcy is fascinated by racing, and he thinks he sees himself as being somebody that's going to end up as a race car driver. And so here he is, this 14-year-old kid, young teenager living in San Diego, and he had a bicycle that he would ride around. And he would oftentimes take his bicycle and go down these hills and go really, really fast. And in his mind, he's thinking, he's this race car driver, and he's picturing him being the youngest, race car champion, etc. So one day, Stephen is on his bicycle and he's going down this hill and he's picking up speed. And again, he's kind of imagining himself being this race car driver, and he's going faster and faster down this hill. And he gets down to the bottom of the hill, and at the same time, coming the other direction is a big station wagon pulling a trailer, and the two of them collide. And Stephen Pearcy goes flying through the air and then lands on the pavement and basically shatters both of his legs. And then the next thing you know, the emergency crews are there. They get him on a stretcher, of course. They take him to the hospital. And he just remembers when he went into the hospital, somebody making the comment, "This kid is never going to walk again." So the next thing you know, he wakes up from the pain and whatever's been, the trauma. And he sees a doctor, and the doctor says, "You're actually really, really lucky." Says a lot of kids who come in with this kind of thing, people that come in with injuries like this, they've broken their back and there's nothing we can do for them. He says, but in your case, we can fix you, but it's going to require some surgery and what have you. So they ended up going through this surgery where they had to basically put his legs back together. Apparently it involved a bone graft from his hip and then wires and screws and anything just to hold his legs back together. And he ended up being in the hospital for 6 months, recovering from this injury. And he talks about just how awful it was being in that situation where he's just stuck in a hospital, he's immobile, and he's also realizing during that time that all of his dreams of being a race car driver are over because of these injuries. So at some point during this period, during this 6-month period that he's now living in the hospital, an acquaintance of his comes into his room one day with a guitar, an acoustic guitar, and hands it to him. And Stephen says, I don't want this. And he says, well, I'm not going to take it home. So he basically just left it there with Stephen. And at one point, he just kind of picks it up and he starts plunking around on this guitar. And and eventually figures out how to just kind of make it make a little bit of decent sound. And so anyway, after 6 months in the hospital or so, he is able to get discharged and go home. But he's on crutches or he's in a wheelchair. And he has a couple of really important experiences. One of these experiences is he gets the opportunity to go see Led Zeppelin in concert. And he talks about this where he goes into this show. And just whenever you hear people talk about seeing Led Zeppelin back in those days, there's this almost religious fervor that people talk about, from everything from, Bonham's drum solo to Jimmy Page's solo to just the whole just overwhelming experience of it all. And when you listen to Stephen Pearcy talk about it, that's the way it affected him too. And he somehow could just see himself doing that there was something about this moment that he could sense it. And also during the same period, his sister had a boyfriend named Pat Tomasky, who came over to the house one time, and Stephen was sitting there with his guitar, because after he got out of the hospital, he just kind of kept playing that guitar, and he picked it up and he actually could play it, this Pat Tomasky, and he could play it really, really well. And so then he started spending some time with Stephen, showing him chords, showing him how to play scales and different things so that he could actually improve on playing this instrument. So eventually, he actually got to the point that he was okay playing the guitar. And so some people approached him about coming and being in their band. And now here's what's so fascinating about that. When these two guys approach him about coming and jamming with him, both these guys played guitar, and they didn't need a guy to come play the guitar. They needed a guy to sing. And they said, if you ever feel interested in trying to sing, why don't you come join us? And Stephen Pearcy goes, I'm not a singer, and I don't really want to pursue singing. I think even at the time his sister made fun of him, like, no, he's not a singer. But either way, he went and just started jamming with these guys and kind of had his first little band, and where he was actually singing. So first of all, this first thing that happened in his life, these stories are so fascinating, because here he is having this thing where he's a 14-year-old kid, and a lot of us have those experiences. We're very young. We know exactly where we're going to go with our life. And he knew he's going to be a race car driver. He's heading down that path. He knows where he's going. He knows what he loves. He knows where his passion is. And then it's taken from him in an instant, in an accident. And then by this weird chance of fate, somebody hands him a guitar. He learns how to play it, and he sees Led Zeppelin, and he feels this new direction in his life. Okay, so now, after he's been with that band kind of crumbles. It doesn't really go anywhere. And eventually he forms a band that's called Mickey Ratt. And this band is based down in San Diego. And they're actually starting to play some gigs, some little places here and there. And he catches wind and hears about this band that's based up in Los Angeles that's called Van Halen. And so Stephen Pearcy decides he wants to go see this band play. And he knows that they're going to be playing at the Whisky on a particular night. And so he makes the road trip from San Diego up to Los Angeles to go to the Whisky. And he gets there really, really early. And he gets there long before the show starts, when they're still kind of loading some things in. And he gets there, and he's, again, there early enough that he actually runs into David Lee Roth as he's about to go in through the back door at the Whisky. And he catches his attention, "Hey, David," and he meets him, and David actually takes him in backstage at the Whisky. And while he's back there talking, he's hanging out there with the guys in the band, and he sees this guy, of course, playing the guitar with this really interesting, cool-looking guitar. And Stephen Pearcy goes, "That's a cool guitar, man." And Eddie Van Halen looks up at him and goes, "Yeah, well, I made this." So that was the moment that Stephen Pearcy and Eddie Van Halen met. And they sit there for the next hour, apparently, before the show starts, just talking about gear. Because Eddie Van Halen, apparently, if you ever wanted to talk about him, you start talking about guitars and he's all ears and you'll have a conversation with him. And because Stephen Pearcy was a guitar player at this point, and he'd actually gotten a couple of nice guitars from some of the money he got from the settlement after his accident, so he had a little bit of gear. And so the thing that those two connected on, interestingly enough, is they started talking about Vox amps. And Eddie Van Halen was playing through a Vox, and he just loved the sound. And Stephen Pearcy says, I've got a Vox. And he says, as a matter of fact, if you ever want to use it or maybe even buy it, I've got this amplifier that maybe you'd be interested in. And Eddie Van Halen goes, love it. And they exchanged phone numbers there backstage at the Whisky. And then Eddie says, you need to stick around and watch the show. So, of course, Stephen then is on a high. He's like, this is so awesome, because everybody knows at that point, Van Halen's kind of an up-and-coming band, and he's kind of just getting a vision of himself in these same places. So then he sticks around and he watches the show. And he says that there weren't more than 30 people at that thing, but they played like they were playing in front of an arena. And he says it just blew his mind just how unbelievable, how incredible this concert was, this show. Even though it was in this small place with this small group of people, he could tell that Van Halen, he could just see it, that they were going to be huge. And so then, not long after this, Stephen Pearcy actually calls Eddie Van Halen, hoping he'll remember him. And he calls him up and he says, "Hey, this is Stephen Pearcy. You remember me?" And he goes, "Yeah, you're the kid with the Vox amp, right?" And he says, "Yeah." And he says, "You still interested in seeing it?" And so Eddie says, "Yeah, absolutely." He says, "Come up to my house in Pasadena and let's chat." So he actually goes up then to visit Eddie Van Halen at his home and grabs a friend of his on the way named Robin Crosby, and they go hang out with Eddie Van Halen for the afternoon. And when they showed up at his house, of course, Eddie's just in his room and he's got all his just guitar parts and stuff laying all over the place. A lot of this stuff that he just got from Charvel. Charvel was kind of the guitar place at the time. They were a repair shop, and they were in the process of, they were going to start building some of their own guitars then. And so Eddie Van Halen frequented there and needed to get all these guitar parts. And while they were there, Robin Crosby fell in love with a Flying V that Eddie had. And Eddie's like, "Yeah, I can fix it up and sell it to you." And anyway, so they just had this afternoon together where they just kind of built this friendship and built this trust, which then would end up becoming a really, really important part of this whole story. Because what happened next was Van Halen was getting ready to play at the San Diego Sports Arena, and he gets this phone call kind of out of the blue. And it was an important part of the story because Stephen Pearcy he'd been a little bit down on everything because it wasn't moving the way he wanted it to. They weren't getting the success that they needed, and he was even contemplating cutting his hair off. And he gets this phone call, and it's Eddie Van Halen. And he says, "Hey, we're playing at the San Diego Sports Arena, and it's bigger than any place we've really played, and we do not have enough gear to play this place. And Stephen," this is Eddie Van Halen saying, "can you help me line up a bunch of amps that we can use tonight at the show?" And so Stephen Pearcy calls his friend Robin Crosby and some other people, and they gather as much gear as they possibly can, and they take it to this concert that Van Halen is playing. And this ended up being another kind of pivotal moment for Stephen Pearcy. Hang on just a second, this will be really quick. With hundreds of videos on our channel now, we've made playlists to make it easy for you to find whatever the thing is that you're interested in. We have a playlist with all of our Rush videos, Kiss, Led Zeppelin, Van Halen. We have categories like 80s metal and even our popular magazine flip-throughs, where we go through page by page with Circus Magazine, Hit Parader, and others, all in 4K resolution. You'll find it all organized and ready to explore. Just click the playlist tab on our channel's homepage. All right, back to the video. Because he goes to this show, he sees this big event, and of course Van Halen's getting bigger and bigger at this point, and even though Stephen wasn't on the stage and he wasn't performing, he had this connection, and he felt that energy, and he felt like he was a part of this massive thing that was taking place there. He understood where this band Van Halen was going. He could see it. He could feel it. He knew that he had the right kind of taste to know what the public was going to like. He was part of this big concert. All of his gear was up on the stage. He'd helped pull this thing off, and that changed him. And he says, I can do this. We're going to do this. And one of the first things he did at that point he says, we got to get out of San Diego, and we are heading to Los Angeles. And it wasn't long after that before Stephen Pearcy is in Los Angeles. And then, of course, Mickey Ratt, the ashes of Mickey Ratt turn into Ratt, which is the band that we all know and love. But I love that story so much because, again, he's heading in one direction as a kid, and through these kind of unusual circumstances, somebody handing him a guitar, and then somebody teaching him how to play the guitar, and then somebody telling him, hey, why don't you, instead of playing the guitar, why don't you sing instead? And then having that moment where he goes to see Van Halen, but happens to run into David Lee Roth, and then happens to meet Eddie. And then all these things come together where he now has this new mission and realizes where he can go with his life. And through all these processes, all these different things, he has that same drive, the drive that got him on that crew when he was 14 years old. That determination to go be a part of something, but then being able to refocus that into this new thing, playing music, and somewhere in the process realizing that he was actually really good. Because if you go back and look at these albums, I mean, just Out of the Cellar alone, if you go down this song list right there, of the 10 songs on this album, he was involved in writing 7 of them. So he really did have this unusual skill for music. Now, a lot of us don't think of him as a guitar player because we have always known him as just the guy that is the singer. But he actually was able to get kind of his musical chops learning how to play the guitar. And he got good enough at music in general that he wrote some of the most classic songs from that era that we have. And then I, of course, became a huge fan of this band after that. And I loved their tone. I loved the music. I loved the look. I thought these guys were just everything about them. I don't know what it was. I just fell in love with Ratt. I was always a big fan of these guys, and so anytime I get a chance to talk about Ratt, I will take it. And so seeing that it was his birthday today, I thought it'd be cool to talk about him and at least tell that part of his story, because success stories are so fascinating, and so often they have these, not only just the drive and the talent, but they have these weird little twists and turns that if they hadn't happened that way, it wouldn't have ended up the way that it did. And so we ended up with, because of all those experiences that he had, with this really, really amazing band, and with him at the core of making that band happen. Now, what I want to share with you today, just to kind of go along with this, is I found, like we often do on this channel, is we find these cool newspaper articles from back in that era. And I found this one, and it really focuses on Stephen Pearcy, and it even touches on a couple of these things in his story too. And it's not very long, but I think you'll find this interesting. And you can see it on your screen right now. This is from the Dayton Daily News, January 8th of 1987. And so in 1987, the album that they would have currently been on at that time was this one right here. I'll just take it out of the plastic while we're at it. This is Dancing Undercover. I loved this album. I thought the song Dance was just, Dance, Dance, Dance is so cool. So they have this little article here where they talk about Stephen Pearcy and tell a little bit of his story. And I thought it'd be kind of interesting to share this with you today. So January 8th of 1987. Of course, there's the band right there. And then the headline is, "It's All Ratt." Stephen Pearcy is the lead singer of Ratt, a 5-piece hard rock band based in Los Angeles. And like most hard rock singers, Pearcy has a way of making an interviewer feel more like a truant officer than a reporter. During a recent telephone interview, Pearcy's demeanor implied that he could be somewhere having loads of fun if it weren't for all the silly questions coming from the bothersome inquisitor at the other end of the line. By hard rock standards, the interview didn't go too badly. Pearcy is a man of few words, but at least he didn't hang up or doze off. Perhaps his restlessness stems from his original vocation. Pearcy started out to be a race car driver, not a rocker. As a young teenager living in San Diego, California, he toured with a twin-engine gas dragster team called the Gas House Gang. A motorcycle accident that broke both of his legs proved to be a turning point for Pearcy, who will perform Monday with Ratt at Hara Arena. Now, of course, that's not correct. It wasn't a motorcycle. It was actually a bicycle, but either way. After I had that mishap, I ended up with a guitar in my hands instead of a car, he said. In 1978, while Pearcy was recovering from the accident, a friend took him to see Van Halen at a small Los Angeles nightclub. Van Halen's performance inspired him to start a group of his own. The scene in San Diego was all dance clubs, and you had to play copy music. I left there in 1980 and formed Ratt in Los Angeles, he explained. Pearcy and the other band members, guitarist Warren DeMartini and Robin Crosby, bassist Juan Krausier, and drummer Bobby Blotzer, made a name for themselves in the Los Angeles rock clubs and eventually released an EP on their own Time Coast label in 1983. The president of Atlantic Records, Doug Morris, caught the band's live act one night and signed them on the spot. Ratt's sound hasn't changed much since those early days, Pearcy said. And it's kind of interesting, another Van Halen connection. If you remember that first video, the first time any of us saw them on MTV was when they did the song Round and Round. And you remember who was on that video was this kind of old Hollywood legend, Milton Berle. Well, Marshall Berle, which was Milton Berle's nephew, was the guy that was Ratt's manager. Now, the Van Halen connection is Marshall Berle was also originally Van Halen's manager. Anyway, it's kind of an interesting connection between the two. The guitar players experiment with the sounds they get, but other than that, our sound is pretty much the same. We're a guitar-oriented band. We don't rely on keyboards to soften our sound or to get us on the radio. There's no copping out here. It's all Ratt. All real and live in black and white. Just guitars, drums, bass, and vocals, Pearcy said. Ratt sounds at times like a younger, faster version of Judas Priest. I don't hear that, but Rob Halford, Judas Priest's lead singer, is an influence of mine. Him and Robert Plant, Pearcy said. The group's first album for Atlantic, Out of the Cellar, became one of the biggest selling rock LPs of 1984. The video for the album's big hit, Round and Round, featured an unlikely appearance by Milton Berle. Uncle Milty, it turns out, is the real-life uncle of Ratt's manager, Marshall Berle. So far, Ratt's career has been moving along at a pace fast enough to satisfy even an old dragster driver. Out of the Cellar sold 3 million. Our second album, Invasion of Privacy, sold 2 million, and Dancing Undercover, Ratt's new album, is already platinum in only 2 months, Pearcy said. Our audience obviously wants us around. We want to be around a long time. We want longevity. We're not bothered by charts. We're not bothered by numbers. And we're not bothered by radio. We just play our music and hope people like it, and they have. And then it goes on there. This is Ratt will appear Monday night at Hara Arena. And the tickets are $14 in advance and $15 at the day of the show. Isn't that amazing how much tickets were back then? Anyway, he is such an interesting character. And his success story is such an unlikely one, at least in the world of rock and roll. And what I would really love to hear is, if you're a musician, what was it that triggered you, that made you decide one day, I'm going to play music? And was it being in the hospital and somebody handed you a guitar? Or what was it that happened? Because everybody has their own story of how that came about. Or if music was going to become an important part of your life, even if you're not a musician, because that is the way it is for a lot of people. They just become immersed in the culture and the music. What was the first band? What was that thing, even if you're not a musician, what was that thing that triggered you? Thanks for watching this video today, and please leave your comments down below. Like the video, of course, and please, if you're not following the channel, please follow the channel. And of course, we really appreciate when you share these things. If you'd share it on Facebook, and I keep saying share it on Twitter. It's hard for me not to say Twitter. If you'd share it on X, if you happen to use X, people remind me every time I say Twitter. It's not Twitter anymore. I know, but I still think, don't we still say tweet things? Because I've never heard anybody say, hey, let's go X something. you still tweet it, right? Anyway, that's a whole nother story. If you have such accounts, we really appreciate you sharing these things with other people. And so anyway, thank you very much for taking the time to be with me today. And with that, have yourself a fantastic day.